Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am joined today by Chas Freeman, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and also the former ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Yes, I'm very happy you can join again. There was a lot I really wanted to discuss with you, but Trump appears to be frustrated. His proposed agreements aren't being received well. Both now coming with threats against the Russians as well as Iran. But I guess to start off with Russia, Trump allegedly made this comment that he's very angry with Putin. How do you see the negotiations working? Is this a bump in the road, or do you see some serious problems?
I think there's been a complete mismatch between the American position as conveyed by Mr. Witkoff and others to the Russians and the Russian position. And it does not appear that Mr. Trump has actually listened to what President Putin has been saying consistently over the years. And that is that the issue is the broad question of European security architecture, Ukraine's neutral place within that architecture, and of course, the issue of the protection of Russian speakers and other minorities in Ukraine. These are the three issues that the Russians have constantly stressed, actually since well before February 24th, 2022, when the invasion started. The war, of course, started in 2014. So the Trump administration focus has been on ceasefires. They worked with Mr. Zelensky in Jeddah to achieve a proposal for a ceasefire directed at energy infrastructure. Mr. Zelensky wanted to extend that to all infrastructure, ports, railroads, and the like. The Russians accepted the stand down on energy infrastructure. Ukraine then struck Russian energy infrastructure. So that ceasefire proposal went nowhere. Then there was a meeting, I believe, in Riyadh, but it may have been in Jeddah, again, Saudi Arabia, with the Russians, which proposed yet another ceasefire agreement. This didn't go anywhere either because Mr. Zelensky found it difficult, and more particularly, the EU, Europeans, said they would not relieve Russia of the sanctions at SWIFT, the clearinghouse for monetary transactions in Brussels, and therefore the ceasefire, which allowed shipping in the Black would have had no consequence for Russian commodity exports because they wouldn't have been able to clear those through the dollar, and they would have been subject still to sanctions. So that went nowhere. So these misfires on the issue of ceasefire were not encouraging. But the ceasefire is not the issue from the Russian point of view. It is something that is conceivable only in the context of a broader understanding about European security architecture, assurances that there will be no hostile forces aimed at Russia stationed in Ukraine, and related issues. So the cart has come before the horse. And at the moment, Mr. Trump is threatening, as he usually does, sanctions on third parties who buy Russian oil. I'll just make a comment here. When I entered the United States Foreign Service, the diplomatic service, one of our main activities was to oppose such sanctions on third parties, specifically the Arab boycott of Israel, which we consider to be contrary to international law. Now it's become a principal tool of our foreign policy. So this is rather ironic. In any event, I think these negotiations have been sidetracked. They're not going anywhere at the moment. The way in which they've been conducted calls into question both the ability of President Trump to listen as opposed to talk and make pronouncements, and the diplomatic competence of his envoys.
Well, I was left with the same impression that he entered these talks with very flawed assumptions about again what the Russians wanted. Because well, initially I had some more optimism because they suggested that well, Hegseth argued there would be, no NATO expansion or security guarantees. There would have to be territorial concessions. A lot of this seemed to be a recognition for the fact that the European security architecture had to be dealt with. But how did that suddenly get translated into a proposal for a ceasefire without addressing any of the political solutions? Also, the one deal they were able to get through again the energy and the Black Sea. Given that Trump he doesn't appear to do any pushback against the Ukrainians when they breached the agreement, and also when the Europeans seemingly are sabotaging some of this by not wanting to go along with sanction relief. Well, what was the plan here? Because they made these deals with the Russians without getting Zelensky or the Europeans on board.
Well, let me make a number of comments, if I may. First, I think it's clear that Mr. Trump does have a strategic objective of reconciliation, rapprochement, and a cooperative relationship with Russia. I think he wants that for a number of reasons. Access to Russian resources. I think he respects President Putin as a strongman. He's drawn to autocrats. And I think he also has in mind some sort of pivot against China, in which it would be essential to neutralize Russia or enlist it in a policy of pressure on China, much as Richard Nixon enlisted the Chinese against the Soviet Union. I think that's a pipe dream. But in any event, if there is this strategic concept, there are not the tactics and the tactical agility to achieve it. And so we've had the mistakes that we were talking about occur. Another comment here is that on the one hand, it's clear that Europeans do not back this American approach. And another way of looking at that is that American leadership of NATO and European alliances is dead. There is no leadership. The nature of the leadership in previous years was that Europeans rather resolutely, usually, backed American policy and decisions. There was a process of consultation that preceded those decisions, but Europeans were happy to have the United States manage the order in Europe during the Cold War and even thereafter. That's gone. Europeans now are openly defiant of American declared policy, and there's a split in the transatlantic alliance, which is quite fundamental. And it's been aggravated by Mr. Trump's ambitions to annex Canada and conquer Greenland somehow from the Danes, who happen to be a very loyal American ally and a NATO member. So the basis for transatlantic cooperation has been seriously compromised, and I would say the leadership of the United States is now disrespected in Europe.
But did you think that the Europeans can achieve what they want in terms of replacing the role of the United States within NATO? Because it seems, I'm not sure if they believe it themselves, or is this just a way of, I guess, calling Trump's bluff and sabotaging some of the efforts or the peace initiative he had with the Russians?
I think it's a failure of imagination. I think it is posturing by European leaders who are quite unsure of their tenure. European politics are complicated, and many of these leaders do not have the confidence of their peoples, and they are posing. I think it is a repetition of a convenient um, fear of Russia, which has been promoted particularly by the UK since the 19th century and has taken very strong root. I'm not going to say that the Russians are not difficult to deal with. They are difficult to deal with. But in the case of your own country, I believe they've kept their agreements when you've made them. It's not impossible to coexist with Russia peacefully. One has to be vigilant. You ask, can the Europeans do what they propose? I think the answer is absolutely not. Europeans do not have the armed forces necessary to give Ukraine victory in Ukraine as they promised. Keir Starmer has an army that cannot fill a football stadium in its entirety, 70,000 men. The Russians have 700,000 men on the Ukrainian front. So I think this is all blather. It's bravado. It should not be taken seriously. And it is, as I said at the outset, more evidence of a failure of an imagination and a lack of a diplomatic strategy than anything else. This is why the Europeans are not at the negotiating table. They do not have a plan for peace. They have a plan for continuing the war, which they are unable to carry out.
That nicely sums up the strategic vacuum we have in Europe. But if Trump can't get cooperation from the Europeans, he can either pressure the Europeans or he can pressure the Russians. Now he seems to have gone after the Russians this time with, I guess, escalating the rhetoric, but also now with sanctions against not just against Russia, but then secondary sanctions as well. So, but what can he realistically get from Russia in terms of yeah, what would be the Russians be willing to cede here, or I'm not sure what they can do in
I
terms
don't
of
think
compromise, because what the Europeans are asking, they still want NATO membership, they still want NATO troops in Ukraine, they still want Russia to pull out of every. I mean, it's a non-starter. So what can Trump? What does he hope to achieve from these sanctions?
I don't think he has an accurate understanding of the situation either on the battlefield or the balance of power in diplomacy. He does not have leverage. He thinks he can gain leverage by sanctions, but Russia is so sanctioned that there is very little he can do. And especially he cannot do it when he has declared economic war on the planet, which he's just done with the most absurdly calculated set of tariffs that anyone could possibly imagine. So, I don't think I've been thinking about what the Chinese might do as the main and ultimate target of all this, I suppose. It's not clear that there's a strategy at all. It seems to be Trump believes that a trade deficit is a ripoff, some kind of theft, and he's determined to end the trade imbalances. The tariffs won't do that, of course. But anyway, with the Chinese, I think the question is, how serious will the Chinese retaliation be? We hear Ursula von der Leyen, I guess it's properly pronounced, saying that there will be strong retaliation from the EU. The Chinese have said there will be retaliation, but I've not heard it quite as strongly as from Europe. And I think the Chinese look at this and they say, we have been challenged to a duel by someone who's busily shooting himself in various parts of his body. Why should we do anything but raise our gun and fire in the air? Our enemy is doing himself in. This is what the Trump policies in the economic area do, is self-sabotage, auto-vandalism, self-destructive behavior. So if you're Chinese, I think you look at this and you say, we can take advantage of this. We want to relieve ourselves of dependence on American supply lines. We want to build relations with other countries. There was a headline in the Wall Street Journal, which I thought was particularly interesting, because it said that Trump's actions mark the end of globalization. They mark the end of globalization for the United States, but they mark probably an acceleration of globalization between others, because the best answer that Europe and China and others have to these tariffs is to intensify their own trade relations outside their trade with the United States. So I think this is not a moment when Mr. Trump is gaining leverage over Russia. And Russia continues to gain ground in Ukraine. And there's no letting up in that. So unfortunately, it looks like the war in Ukraine is going to continue. That means more dead Ukrainians, more dead Russians, more profits for arms manufacturers. And of course, in the meantime, Europe is beginning the very long process of developing a European alternative to American protection. When I was at the Defense Department, I learned that it takes 20 years to form a division to full competence, to get the equipment, to train the men, to develop the esprit, to have the discipline, to develop the capabilities in the officers. You don't make an independent defense force overnight. And even powerful countries like Germany have allowed their armed forces to deteriorate to an extreme extent. And it'll take at least a decade, probably more, to recover. And of course, all of this is particularly idiotic because the Russians have no capability to go beyond Ukraine, as they've demonstrated on the ground in Ukraine, or they have seen that they cannot advance to Paris or even Berlin. And so the myth of a Russian threat, for anybody who's rational and looks at reality, has been exploded. And so why devote all your effort to preparing for a fight with an enemy that doesn't have the capability really to do anything serious to you? So Europe is still caught in a dilemma. It needs a diplomatic strategy. It does not need a military strategy. The military strategy should be derived from a diplomatic strategy and intended to guarantee and back that strategy's success. But there is no diplomatic strategy at all. Instead, there's a refusal to talk to the Russians still, and an incapacity to do anything to help Ukraine.
Yeah, regarding the Chinese response, there's a quote I think usually attributed to Napoleon, which is never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. So that might be the thought in Beijing at the moment. But no, I'm also a bit taken aback by the European approach because, they're very clear about this. There is no plan. Nobody wants to pick up the phone and actually call Moscow and start diplomacy. And still, they can't win the war either. I'm not sure how they're going to have 20 years to prepare. I think the intelligence chief of Germany made the point that we should keep this war going for another 5 years so we have time to rebuild our armies. So we're not making any friends in Ukraine either these days. Even former people who used to be very pro-Western are now starting to realize that they're just being used as cannon fodder for the Europeans. So I think, just mistake after mistake is done and an absence of strategic thinking. However, if at least for the time being, the peace negotiations aren't moving forward, that means the war will continue, and the Russians are, I guess they never gave up on the idea that this war might have to be won on the battlefield. How are you reading the situation at the moment on the front lines?
I think the Ukrainians are giving ground everywhere, and that will continue. I can't imagine that morale in the Ukrainian armed forces is anywhere near as strong and good as it was, given the uncertainties that Ukraine now faces. I think realistically, if the war goes on, we're talking about a Ukraine that has no Black Sea coast, that is a rump state, that is still the poorest and most corrupt in Europe. And when one talks about European Union membership for Ukraine, assuming that the French agricultural sector would agree to that, which is very dubious. Perhaps if Ukraine is stripped of all its agricultural lands by the Russians, it will be able to get into the EU after all. But this is not a desirable path to entry into Europe. The one thing that a European accession process does is promote reforms, and the EU has been very successful at that everywhere, even in Turkey, although it's backsliding now. One interesting aspect of all this, of course, is that the Turks now have a great deal of leverage over Europeans, because without the United States, their power is essential to any European diplomatic or defense strategy. Unfortunately for Europe, Mr. Erdogan seems to be off his medications and behaving a little oddly. So we'll see what happens. But this is not a pretty picture at the moment. And it certainly it rebuts the ridiculous assertion that the war could be ended in 24 hours on which Mr. Trump campaigned for the presidency. We're talking a long period. As I've said before, rearranging European security architecture will not be simple. Negotiating an agreed state of neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine will not be simple. And accepting that Russia has swallowed parts of Ukraine that are Russian-speaking will be a hard swallow for Europeans. So the United States is moving away to start a war with Iran, apparently, rather than hanging on in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, a lot of the things that made Ukraine a bit of a treasure cove is all located in the east, though. That is the fertile soil, the most important natural resources, the Black Sea coast. Yeah, it's also a strategic territory. So I think, no, it's. I wish there would be, yeah, some revival of strategic thinking in Europe. But so far, yeah, the Americans can't get their negotiations going. The Europeans do not want peace. They can't win the war. And meanwhile, I get the impression, or at least I'm hearing, that the Russians are preparing a massive offensive because the Ukrainians look like they're in a bit of a wobbly position. So they want to take advantage and see if they can, well, stretch them out on a wider front and begin to encircle large groups and yeah, get the collapse to intensify. But yeah, no, I just this is
Picture.
sorry.
It is not a pretty picture.
No,
And
I'm
I'm really sorry for the Ukrainians who have been used as a tool to weaken and isolate Russia and who've suffered greatly in that role. And there's no end in sight at the moment.
no, I share that sentiment, and also I think the difficulties will intensify quite dramatically over the coming months, probably, if this offensive goes through as planned. Um, yeah, while I still have some time, I also wanted to ask about the other negotiation not going Trump's way. It might have been the wrong expectations, much like with Russia, which is with Iran. That is, Trump made this ultimatum to the Iranians saying that Well, he wants effectively a new nuclear deal. It's unclear to me exactly what he wants this to encompass, and otherwise, yeah, he will bomb them like they've never seen before, or something along those lines. What do you make of this? Do you think the Iranians can meet them halfway? And if not, is the US actually prepared to go to war against a country like Iran? Because it seems like it will be a war, everything or nothing. Because if it's just a little bit of bombing, Iran would probably react or respond with nuclear weapons, or developing them, that is. So, how are you reading this situation? Because this is a very, very dangerous escalation.
Well, again, I think there is some distance between Mr. Trump and his minions, his subordinates. His subordinates appear to want regime change and to reduce Iran to the level of Syria, that is, disarm it, basically leave it with only token sovereignty. So Mike Waltz, who is the National Security Advisor, has stated publicly that Iran must not only give up its non-existent weapons program. He said this right after the CIA had reaffirmed their judgment that Iran had not made a decision to build a bomb. So they must reverse a decision that they haven't made. But they also must give up their peaceful nuclear program, and they must destroy all their missiles. So this is basically, it reminds me of the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum to Serbia. You know, there were 9 demands that Serbia accepted. They did not accept the 10th, and the Austro-Hungarians went to war, which set off World War I. This is a diplomatic ultimatum that is designed to fail and to produce an attack. And Iran has been quite definite that in return, it will attack American bases, of which they number 10 in their immediate vicinity. One supposes they will also attack Israel, although they have not said that, as far as I can tell. And so what we're talking about is a regional war. And I think very likely, as you said, the lesson will be learned by Iran that they need to have a nuclear deterrent. So far from preventing nuclear proliferation and the development of a regional nuclear threat to Israel, an existential threat, if you will, it is likely to produce one. And here I have to say that the Israelis are essentially not just paranoid, but psychotic in their view of Iran. They think Iranians get up in the morning and thinking about how to kill Jews. Well, there's quite a thriving Jewish community in Tehran and in Iran. And I think that the Iranians are not fixated on that at all. I think they are seeking leadership in the Muslim world, using the Palestinian issue for that purpose. And they may very well be moved by the suffering of the Palestinians to feel that they have to do what they can to support them. At the moment, that consists essentially of supplying the Houthis with the means to carry out a Red Sea blockade and nothing more. If a war happens with Iran, I'm not sure what the outcome would be. There are serious military thinkers who suggest that a combination of Iranian missiles and swarms of small boats with missiles would wreak havoc on the American attackers. I don't know whether that would be the case or not, but I don't think any war is a surefire thing. War is always a gamble, and I think the Pentagon is not enthusiastic about going to war with Iran. I don't think Mr. Trump really wants it. I think he wants to do a deal, but he has surrounded himself with people who don't want a deal. who want a war agree with Netanyahu about that. And so we don't have an America first policy in West Asia. We have an Israel first policy. And that is very clear. And that leads ineluctably, apparently, under current circumstances, to a war with Iran. Most of the bombing and naval capability necessary to do that is now in place. So we're ready, almost.
Well, when the decision was made to attack Yemen, as we learned from those signal leaks, Vance had referred to it as it's a bit of a strange, embarrassing leak, but yeah, nonetheless, Vance apparently referred to it as a mistake, suggesting that it was more of a European war than American. But so there are obviously divisions there within the camp, but as you already suggested. But what are you hearing though? Or are you hearing anything about any rivalry for America first versus yeah, which yeah, JD Vance appears to be representing, or versus the more neocon groups, because they seem to be going along two different tracks at the moment.
I took JD Vance's use of Europe as a scapegoat as just that he didn't want to say this is a war for Israel. He preferred to blame it on the Europeans, and that drew applause actually from the other participants. One thing I will say is I had suspected when I read the transcript of that chat that this was not the only chat these people had had on Signal. And it has now been revealed that indeed there were 20 discussion groups of different policy issues operating on Signal between these people. When this conversation took place, one of the participants, Ms. Witkoff, was in Moscow. Ms. Gabbard was in Bangkok. And so, you know, telephones, even with Signal, are not secure at all because of programs like the ones the Israelis have invented, that Pegasus, that actually get into the phone and mean that the encryption is meaningless. So this was clumsy. It was amateurish. The discussion was unprofessional. Even when you have a secure telephone, I was involved in a war in Saudi Arabia. Even when I had a secure telephone, I would not have discussed timing, bombers, anything of that sort over an electronic medium. So this was amateur hour, not very reassuring.
Yeah. So this is, have you seen anything like this in the past? This kind of the way the communication was done, or is this again, you
No,
have plenty of experience from yeah, the top
no,
levels, so
no. There are classified video conferencing and audio conferencing means. But all of these people have staffs who manage those things for them. They had the alternative of using an established method. What is particularly surprising is that since Mike Waltz previously worked, I believe, for Dick Cheney in the White House, he should know all of these things. And yet he, apparently somebody on his staff, oh, sorry, actually it appears that the conversation was put together by someone in the Pentagon. Maybe he didn't know who Jeffrey Goldberg was and included him in the chat. So one has to wonder, you know, where Jeffrey Goldberg's telephone number came from. Was it on Hegseth's telephone, or was it on Waltz's telephone, or whose phone was it on? Because Jeffrey Goldberg is a dyed-in-the-wool neoconservative. And there's just been a purge in the White House National Security Staff of people accused of being neocons by an outsider. Things are, and we don't know what Mr. Waltz's tenure is now, given the series of mistakes that have been made. This is not a moment of reassuring efforts at leadership, even if American leadership in Europe is, as I said, a thing of the past.
Yeah, one would have thought that Trump would have been a bit more careful, given that his first administration was seen as being, sabotaged from within. But nonetheless, it seems, the same problems continue. My last question, though, was about how this could affect the wider region. Again, you're a former U.S. ambassador of Saudi Arabia. Do you think it would be possible for the United States to pull in a lot of the regional actors, such as Saudi Arabia, into war against Iran?
No. I thought it was very instructive that when the stealth bombers began to gather at Diego Garcia, the aerial refueling tankers that had been based in Qatar left Qatar. Qatar does not want to be in a war with Iran, nor does Saudi Arabia. Not even the UAE, which has a dispute over islands near the Strait of Hormuz with Iran, wants to be in a war. And in fact, my interpretation of the way the geopolitics of the region have been evolving is that the exact opposite of the intended purpose of the Abraham Accords is what is emerging. That is to say, the Abraham Accords, aside from being intended to set aside the Palestine issue and shelve it in order to gain acceptance for Israel in the region where it has established itself, one of the purposes was to form a grand coalition against Iran between linking Israel, the Saudis, the UAE, and others in such a grouping. But I think the exact opposite is happening, since Israel has chosen to seize territory in Lebanon, Syria, and now openly to try to annex part of Gaza while carrying out a genocide and ethnic cleansing and indiscriminately bombing Syria, even in its capital, and Lebanon in its capital. I think the region is coalescing into an Arab-Iranian coalition aimed at balancing Israel. And so I don't think it's very likely that any Arab country will facilitate what Mr. Trump's advisors at least seem to be planning.
Would it be possible for Saudi Arabia to get that close with Iran? That would have to mean, to a very large extent, distance itself from the United States.
Well, it has been distancing itself, mainly by building relationships with countries like China, India, Russia, Brazil, some of the European countries. But you have to remember, before the Islamic Revolution, Iran was still a Shiite country. It was under the Shah, and the Shah was the regional gendarme for the United States, and the Saudis depended on him. There was a good relationship. Actually, that Iran had a good relationship with Israel because it wasn't Arab, and the Israelis thought they could peel it off, and they did, to some extent, peel it off from support for the Palestinian cause. Of course, things have changed, but nothing is forever, and especially not in the Middle East. We're talking about nations modeled on tribal governance, and tribal governance switches alliances and enemies with ease. So I wouldn't rule out anything. I don't think Saudi Arabia wants in any way to be subordinate to Iran. But I think the Iranians are quite clever enough to work out a partnership which doesn't imply that, if the United States becomes a sufficient menace.
Yes, I was supposed to be my last question, but Israel, do you see them as pursuing a bit of a suicidal path now? Because it seems as if if a lot of these conflicts end, then they would end up turning a bit against each other because of the internal divisions. Or you don't consider this a
Well,
possibility,
militarily,
something that's impacting the Saudis' calculations, perhaps?
militarily, they're on the ascendancy. I mean, they have essentially achieved military domination of the Levant. They are a threat to the Saudis and others, and they are so perceived, particularly because it has become apparent that the United States cannot restrain them. And in fact, the way in which previous Israeli wars ended was the United States pulled them up short, and they had to end them. But the Trump administration is all in support of them. So I don't think this is compatible with the kind of relationship the United States had with the Saudis and others in the past. It was possible to argue in the Cold War that we had a common enemy in the Soviet Union, and that therefore we should set aside our differences over Palestine. That common enemy no longer exists. The differences over Palestine are now acute as the genocide proceeds. The populace in Arab countries is irate. The leaders have to defer to that anger. They cannot afford to cross it. And so things have changed. Israel is politically, economically, and legally isolated. It is now an outlaw. Perhaps Viktor Orban, it feels free to leave the International Criminal Court and ignore the warrant for Mr. Netanyahu's arrest. But that is actually symbolic of the fact that Israel is now an outlaw. It is outside the realm of international law and legality, as well as morality and human decency. And so Israel is greatly weakened by this, even as it is militarily ascendant. Inside Israel, the army is demoralized and fatigued. When the call comes out to reservists to report for duty, the unit is lucky to get 60 or 70% turnout. The hostage families are outraged by Netanyahu's clear political manipulation of the hostage issue to keep himself in power. The Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox are outraged by many things that are happening in Israeli society, as well as by the threat of conscription to fill out the ranks of the army. The famous startups, Israel is a startup nation, very full of very smart people who are very entrepreneurial, have a lot of support from the West in terms of funding and encouragement to do new things. That has basically gone offshore. There are, I don't know the number anymore. The last time I looked, there were 64,000 bankruptcies of small businesses in Israel. The economy is tanking. The debt is going up. The taxes are going up. This is not a happy place. And Mr. Netanyahu is spending his days when he isn't trying to annihilate the Palestinians, he spends his days in court defending himself against mounting charges of corruption and misbehavior. So it's pretty wobbly. There are lots of people in Israel who wonder whether the Israeli state can survive. And many are emigrating for this reason. There are 2 or 3 million who have Spanish and Portuguese passports because Spain and Portugal very kindly agreed to rectify the expulsion of the Jews in 1492 by issuing passports to the descendants of the Sephardic Jews who inhabited there. Israel has no friends in the region. It is in an icy peace with Egypt. It is violating the Camp David Accords in the Philadelphia corridor. Egypt is smarting under the humiliation. Um, it is it has no answer to the Palestinian presence in Palestine except murder. This is not a recipe for long-term survival. So the military ascendancy should not be confused with power and longevity.
Well, Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for your insights. It's yeah, that was fascinating. Really, Europe and Middle East are getting a bit unraveled by this new negotiation tactics, it seems. So, thanks again.
Thank you, and have a pleasant evening. Bye-bye.
Likewise.